I think it increases our ability to empathize with the experiences of others. And that's true across time, but also in our own present moment. That the more we understand about the history of the church, the history of our nation, the history of, I do local history as well, even understanding the history of like literally where we live, helps us understand that, that our experience, my experience, is not universally shared, even among people in my own day and age, and certainly not across history as well. And I think it should help us become a little bit more empathetic towards others in our own present moment. Also, perhaps a bit more gracious at times towards the struggles that others have faced, and just sort of opening our again, kind of opening our eyes, opening our minds to the idea that my experience, as John Young, is not universal.
Hey everyone, welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today I sat down with John Young, assistant professor of church history at Amridge University. Now, John and I first met a few years ago at the Stone Campbell Journal Conference in Knoxville, Tennessee, and soon became friends when we discussed our dissertation topics, which, at the time, we were still working on. John's work in history at the postgraduate level was very helpful for me as I had to wade into the methods of historians whose area of emphasis lies outside the Bible. John and I had a delightful conversation during our episode today about how, believe it or not, teaching church history can actually be spiritually formative. In our interview, John had lots to say on how church history is valuable even for non-historians. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that John has published a few books on church history, and I'll put a link to those in the description. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we're having here on the podcast, would you be willing to like and subscribe to us, and maybe share us with someone that you think might benefit from this? And as always, thank you so much for tuning in today. John, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, sir. Really appreciate you jumping in here with us.
It's great to be here. Excited to be able to share a little bit about history, church history, what kind of value it might have for those like us, or I guess people who are not like us, who have not chosen history as a career,
Right,
or a dissertation or a calling or whatever phrase you want to use there.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and for those of you who are still with us after that introduction, we will.
It is pretty compelling.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. John, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school, and help us kind of get to know you a little bit before we get into church history, Stone Campbell movement history, all that good stuff that we just mentioned here.
Well, sure. Well, I as my accent probably communicates here, I am a lifelong Alabamian. I grew up in Florence, Alabama, one of the hotbeds of churches of Christ.
I was going to say, I've heard of Florence.
No, okay. Yes. Dating back to the work of T.B. Larimore in the 19th century, sort of a hotbed of churches of Christ, of Restoration Movement history. I attended the successor school to Larimore's Mars Hill College, which is now Mars Hill Bible School, from kindergarten to 12th grade. Went all the way through there, graduated in 2008, moved to Tuscaloosa, where I still live, in the fall of 2008. Started as an undergraduate history and political science student. Completed my degree in 2012 and had originally planned to go to law school. I started law school, stayed for about 3 months, decided that wasn't for me.
Okay.
We'll talk more about that in a second. But then I enrolled in a master's program and then a PhD program in history. Graduated from there, also from Alabama last year in right at the beginning of COVID times. And I now work as an assistant professor in the Turner School of Theology at Amridge University, based in Montgomery, but the appointment is fully online, so I still live here in Tuscaloosa.
All right. I've heard of Tuscaloosa also.
Yes, the home of football. So some people act as if it is.
Yeah. As a lifelong Tennessee Volunteers fan, I have heard all about Tuscaloosa. At least in the Saban era, right?
Right.
During Fulmer's heyday, it was Knoxville.
Yeah,
Those
same thing
days are
got
long
here a
gone,
year
though.
before I did. So I like to think I could take some credit for the football success since then, but
Yeah,
probably not too
yeah,
much.
you should. You should. I didn't know about law school. What can I ask? What was it about? Where and like what was it about law school where you eventually said, "This is not for me"?
Well, sure. I actually had gotten accepted and enrolled and started at the law school, also here at Alabama,
Okay, cool.
University of Alabama Law School. I had worked as an intern at the district attorney's office back home full time for several summers,
Mhm.
and even though I had declared a history major as an undergraduate, my plan had always been, even from early high school all the way through, to become a lawyer.
Mhm.
But then when I actually got to law school, a couple months in, I really figured out that this just was not what I wanted to be doing for a career. I realized that what I really enjoyed was the people I worked with at the
Oh.
office rather than the actual material and sort of what I would be doing. And I had this moment where I was sitting in the law library in the history section one day, and I was working on some readings for, I guess it was probably contracts class, and I decided that what I would rather be reading basically anything off of the shelf right now. So there's sort of a book about William the Conqueror up there for some reason. And
Hey, there you
I
go,
don't care
man.
anything about William the Conqueror, but it was like I'd rather be reading that than this. And
Yeah.
so I actually dropped out a couple of weeks later, and then started taking history grad classes about a month later when the semester rolled over. This
Wow.
would have been fall of 2012 going into spring of 2013.
Okay.
And so, yeah, my brief and not so illustrious legal career came to a conclusion there, but it led me to what I needed to be doing, which was studying history instead. So,
Fascinating. Yeah. I did not know that about you because I had
yep.
a similar experience. It just took me a little bit longer to realize. I graduated from Harding as a history major, and took all the history classes that one would expect. American history. Things like Jacksonian era all the way up to 1945 and the present, stuff like that. Reformation and Renaissance and Reformation, that kind of stuff. And then was thinking I'll teach high school history and social studies, but it would be more advantageous for me to go ahead and have a master's degree because where I was anticipating going to teach would be in public school system back in Nashville because that's where I'm from, and both my folks are public school teachers. I grew up in the public school system, so it made sense on paper. I was about halfway through my master's of science in education the day that I stepped foot onto the high school campus for pre-student teaching. It just hit me. It's like, no. But I didn't really know what to do with it at that point. The other thing that I really, really noticed was actually when I was in the middle of student teaching. I was preparing lessons, my PowerPoints for what we're going to do, and I actually had a really great student teaching experience. But I was sitting in my room and I looked at a shelf, So I was like, as soon as you said you were looking at a shelf in the
Yep.
library, I looked at a shelf and I saw some of these books up here behind me. And I looked at those and thought, I miss that. And
Yeah.
specifically what I was looking at was a Greek New Testament because I had minored in Greek because I thought it'd be fun, right? I had no idea at that point that was God saying something like, "Hey, Kevin, maybe I've gifted you for something along these lines." I just thought I just really liked studying the Bible, specifically the Greek New Testament. So eventually, through some professors who were there in the history department and some others, I thought, oh, MDiv en route to a PhD. Okay, yikes, that's a long time, but that's what I need to be doing. So anyway, a neat connection.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about
Yeah,
yourself.
I traded 3 years of law school for, I guess it ended up being 7 years, 8 years of history graduate work instead. There's a doctorate at the end of either program, but one took considerably longer than the other to get
I
through.
know.
But
To your advantage, though, at least people now will call you doctor. They'll call you Dr.
yes,
Young.
yes.
Yeah. That's JDs are great. They're useful. They do what they do. They are doctorates, but nobody calls you doctor with just a JD. So
And depending on the point of the semester, sometimes students will throw in everything from exalted Reverend, Doctor, Professor, depending on how much they need extra credit towards the end. All the honorifics, the titles sort of multiply at times. So.
That was one fun thing about going to Asbury Seminary, which is, it's not a Methodist school, but it is profoundly and deeply shaped by a Wesleyan tradition. And so one expression, one manifestation of a Wesleyan tradition is all the various types of Methodist churches. And I had some friends who either went into, who were in the United Methodist Church, or some friends who were who eventually joined the Anglican Church of North America. And so not as opposed to the Episcopal Church, specifically the Anglican Church of North America. And they get all these cool titles like, Reverend Doctor, such and such. It's like, man, I'm just brother so-and-so.
Brother Doctor, I suppose.
Brother Doctor. I like, we're going to make that a thing. We're going to make that a thing.
That'll work.
Yeah. Here we go. Brother Doctor.
This has been a productive day already.
We could probably call it a day right now. Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. So University of Alabama, master's in history, PhD in history. You specifically mentioned at the introduction here, you specifically mentioned that you were, that we were talking about church history and things along those lines. How'd you get into church history? Why church history? And even more specifically than that, why the history of our church tradition, our church branch, the Stone Campbell movement, the American Restoration movement? There goes by a couple of names.
Sure.
What sort of piqued your interest in all this?
Yeah. So when I left law school and decided that I wanted to study history, I didn't actually know what I wanted to study. I certainly didn't have any idea of what I wanted to research. This was not a moment where I sort of, had a moment where I just knew for sure that I wanted to do church history and anything of the sort. And really across that first semester, I kind of struggled with kind of casting about. I was taking classes, wasn't really involved with any research at first, but I knew I was going to have to start working on my first article, first seminar paper, these kinds of things. Even at the master's level, there's some research requirements, and so. It wasn't until the very last semester of that first semester of taking history graduate courses that we read a book, and I've actually got it here for the listeners or viewers at home, rather those who are watching rather than listening on the podcast, a book called To Serve God in Walmart by Bethany Morton. We read this in just a sort of a grad level American history class. And it was a book that, my research doesn't have really anything to do specifically with it, but it's an exploration of the intersections of kind of business culture, free enterprise, and also Christian education. And a lot of it is set in Arkansas. So Harding University actually plays a pretty large role in the book. And I was sort of sitting there reading through this, preparing for the last week of classes. And I was like, wait, people actually study about the churches of Christ for a living? I was like, and I guess at some level, I sort of knew that was the thing, right? I grew up in Florence, at Heritage Christian, right? There are people who studied the history of the Restoration movement for a living. I'd heard presentations, but it never really sort of clicked that could be something that I could do also. And so kind of reading through this, I was like, okay, there's maybe a space here at Alabama for me to be able to do some of this kind of research. So in the following semester and across that next year and a half or so, I really dug into a project on T.B. Larimore, kind of one of the most famous late 19th, early 20th century figures in the Restoration movement, especially within churches of Christ. That also related to the history of education and some of his work as an educator, not just as a minister. And then from there, started looking into the history of some of the smaller groups associated with our fellowship and with our movement. And that's what turned into the dissertation. And then, kind of got hands in several different other kinds of projects at this point. And again, sort of I guess you could sort of say happenstance, or perhaps something more spiritual than that. But whatever it was fortunate. It led me to what I'm doing today.
Yeah, man. Okay, so you kind of just backed into it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not expecting to go into that. When you talk to us about your church background, as I'm curious if it was the same as mine. The church that I grew up in, attending in Nashville, the church where my mom grew up, my folks are still there. My brother's a deacon there, so the church is very much important to me. And I had a wonderful experience. Learned to love God's word and His people. We talked about things wild and mildly controversial things like grace and the Holy Spirit and stuff.
Right.
Stuff like
shocking.
That. I know, right? I don't know, but I don't remember hearing much or anything about how we got to do the things that we do.
Sure.
Was your experience different, or how did that work for you?
Largely similar. So again, I grew up in Florence, in the congregation I attended growing up, which was the Chisholm Hills congregation. I still have family there as well. Several of the faculty members from Heritage, at the time it was International Bible College, were also members there, and so sort of grew up sitting, kind of hearing lessons from them and these kinds of things. But there wasn't necessarily a whole lot of discussion about the history of Churches of Christ, the history of the Restoration movement. There was certainly a scholarly bent within the congregation, of proximity to the college, but not much on the history. I do remember I was probably maybe fourth grade, fifth grade, a little too young to appreciate it. Actually, a faculty member from, I'm not sure if it was International Bible College or Heritage Christian yet at that time, did maybe a summer series, a few weeks class on the history of the Restoration movement. And of course, being in the fourth grade, fifth grade, I was a little too young to really appreciate it. I hadn't quite caught the history bug yet. Certainly not the church history bug.
Sure.
Looking back on it, it's sort of one of those missed opportunities that perhaps I could have gotten started in some of this stuff a little bit sooner. But it was not necessarily something that was any kind of sustained study or discussion. There was no sort of prohibition against talking about us having a history, but it wasn't necessarily something that came up super often either.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've only been in one church that had I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think it's just only one church that had a sustained, like quarter-long class on the American Restoration movement. And it was a church that I was actually preaching for at the time, but it wasn't me. It was our friend Garrett Best, who did a great, he did a great class on American Restoration movement history. And a lot of the class was just sort of taking big topics that early restoration leaders talked about, and sort of giving quotes in big sections, and just like direct quotes from a lot of things that he had read. That was a fun class, but that's the only time. And it was from a guy who had gotten his MDiv and was en route to his PhD. There's not a ton of folks who can just have that kind of time to study and do all that. Let me ask this: what's the value of church history? And let's maybe for the sake of kind of starting broad and then narrowing it down, what's the value of understanding history of the church? Let's start, Jesus and the book of Acts. Let's start there, and then kind of work our way up towards narrowing it down a little bit for American Restoration movement. What's the value of knowing that history for folks like, folks in the pews, or even folks who are in ministry or some kind of teaching position like you?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll say sort of the glib answer is that the value of church history is that it got me a job. But I think kind of more broadly than that, I guess I really kind of think about it as having, when we talk about the study of church history writ large, as having applicability, as having value in maybe three main areas. This is kind of some stuff that I've been thinking through, and I had mentioned to you recently, I did another lesson series at church where we got into some of this material. So if you see me kind of glancing down at my notes here, I'm
that's all right. Well, and
this.
like I like catching up, but like you post about this kind of stuff on social media, and every now and then I'll see it and it's like, man, that's a cool class. How can we farm John out to come teach something over here?
Be careful what you ask for.
Right.
But in terms of value of church history, I guess the first thing where I really see a benefit for church history for people who are not historians or church historians by training or profession is that it really opens our eyes to the possibility and really to the reality that things have not always been as they are today. Without historical conscience, it's very easy for us to just sort of assume that whether things are good, bad, or ugly in the present moment, and this extends beyond a church history discussion to history writ large, is to say that we assume that things are unchanging, or that the way that things are now is how they always were, and therefore that's how they always have to be going forward. And I think sometimes studying church history, certainly over the span of 2,000 years, but even within Restoration movement history in a couple of centuries, we find that often there has been more change certainly a lot of commonality, a lot of continuity, but also areas in which change has taken place. Debates, divisions, topics that aren't even on our radar now, were things that divided the church, or people were were labeled heretics for certain views, or all
Right.
sorts of things and those are not even on our radar today. So again, it kind of opens our eyes to the possibility of change over time. Second, sure.
Just to jump in with one kind of brief example of that, you talk about debates that aren't even on our radar these days. Not that long ago, right, in the grand scheme of world history, not that long ago, it was a big issue whether you celebrated communion with one cup,
right,
or you had individual cups, and
right.
there was a lot of discussion about that. Interesting too that also, there was some practical reason for changing from one cup
Yes.
to individual cups as people began to understand about germs in the midst of a pandemic that was experienced, or an epidemic at least, 100 years ago. So
right, and even kind of another example that always comes to mind for me within kind of Restoration movement history circles, and thinking about kind of different practices within the churches of Christ, is that one of the groups that I study and that I wrote about in my dissertation turned book is a group known as the Christadelphians, which are a small, mostly British, some in the U.S. and some in Australia as well, kind of offshoot of the movement, dating back to a disagreement, dispute between their founder John Thomas and Alexander Campbell. And although Thomas was involved in a lot of sort of, we might call prophetic speculations, different kind of views in the millennium, so he and Campbell get along in a lot of different areas. But the thing that actually sort of forced the debate or the division between the two was whether it was necessary for believers from other traditions to be rebaptized upon joining the Restoration movement. And Thomas said yes, and Campbell said no. And Thomas was actually basically kicked out of the movement, was sort of put on blast by Campbell, and sort of sent packing over that. Well, and then in many circles in the churches of Christ today, that position, Thomas's position, is the one that actually took root. And so when I kind of explain that story, people question and sort of say, well, wait, our movement was the one that said that people didn't have to be. But yes, actually, right, things change over time. And so it just kind of opens our eyes to, things that we, again, right, wrong, or indifferent on the substance of the matter, things that maybe we would sort of accept unquestioningly are perhaps much more recent developments than we might realize.
Yeah. All right. So that was the first thing. Things
Sure.
have not always been the same. And that kind of, I think a phrase you used earlier was historical consciousness. I like that notion. All right. What's you said there were three. What's another thing you can share with us?
Second would be that I think it increases our ability to empathize with the experiences of others. And that's true across time, but also in our own present moment, that the more we understand about the history of the church, the history of our nation, the history of, I do local history as well, even understanding the history of like literally where we live, helps us understand that, that our experience, my experience, is not universally shared, even among people in my own day and age, and certainly not across history as well. And I think it should help us become a little bit more empathetic towards others in our own present moment. Also, perhaps a bit more gracious at times towards the struggles that others have faced, and just sort of opening our eyes, opening our minds to the idea that my experience, as John Young, is not universal. That the human experience is, in ways good, bad, and ugly, much more varied than what I've lived in my 31 years.
Yeah, very true. One thing that I know a lot of folks experience, say, in a church context, is when they first go on some kind of overseas mission trip to a developing country.
Yes.
And they suddenly realize, maybe I complain a little too much about some things that are actually kind of relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, that can, I can see how that can help, or at least be a similar type of experience from kind of what you're describing here.
Yeah, and sometimes you're going to see debates over dividing between matters of primary and secondary importance is often in the eye of the beholder, but things that we might describe as matters of secondary importance, when churches are sometimes splitting over those kinds of issues, it's sort of evidence that the church has had space to grow, and it's not sort of constantly under attack, right? It's sort of a church that is fighting for its existence and survival is not, splitting over, the color of the carpet or any other sort of number of issues of, what do you call that, secondary, tertiary, or beyond that importance. That things that we might be inclined to sort of draw lines in the sand over are not globally important in ways, and it's certainly not always historically important either. Again, the thing, kind of reverse of what we said earlier, the things that historical actors often found very important, well, they would be just as confused by the things sometimes that we make matters of first importance. If they were to see us in our context today.
Yeah, very true. Very true. All right, so ability to empathize with the different experience of others, which is really it's really humanizing. In a way, history can help us humanize other people that otherwise we might not know, or it might be less inherently sensitive to, for any number of reasons. Yeah. Okay. Right. And the third thing that you mentioned.
Sure. History at its core is storytelling. That there's a lot of other things that goes into history. There's research, there's the archival work, there's the sifting through evidence, interpretations, these kinds of things. But ultimately, the finished product of history is a story. And I think this is where church history has something important to offer to the kind of the person in the pew, is that studying church history and considering our place, whether as an individual or as a movement, in the longer history of church history, allows us to perhaps to better understand our role, not only in the human experience, but in the long sweep of church history and God's redemptive work, and trying to understand ourselves as being part of something much larger than ourselves, something that is moving from one place to another, that is moving towards an end in some way, and that there's stuff that needs to be done before that time too, and figuring out where my contributions, maybe I'm not a historian, maybe I'm not a scholar, but I'm part of the body, I'm part of the church. I have something that I need to be doing. And sometimes having a broader sort of longer perspective on church history and the ways in which people have lived in the church over 2,000 years can help open, again, using the phrase, open our eyes, eyes to the possibilities that we have in front of us today.
Yeah. I did not ask you to go into this, but I'm curious if you would be willing to at least kind of dig into this a little bit. As a historian, like you said, history at its core is storytelling. Say that you are wanting to tell the story of either an event or a person or something along those lines. Would you be willing to walk us through kind of briefly that process of, sure. I've got these these data points. How do I need to form some kind of coherent story? Talk to us about selectivity, because that actually, when you talk about doing history and telling a story, that actually gives us some insight to what, say, the evangelists were doing, because they are telling the story of Jesus's life, and Matthew will include something that Mark won't, and vice versa, and John has a lot of stuff that the others don't, and so there's some degree of selectivity in there. Can he kind of give us the 10 peso version, sort of walk us through how how that actually works?
Yeah, and I think that comparison is apt because, in the beginning of Luke and Acts, right, there's this discussion of sifting through witnesses and the process of research that went into those books, which I think is really interesting. John also talks about at the end of his gospel about how many other things could have been written.
Right.
He just, doesn't have space, and all the books in the world don't have space to contain them. Let me give an example from a project that I'm actually kind of working on recently, because I think giving us will help work through this. So,
so this is a sneak peek into
this is an article that's coming out next year. This is actually some research I presented at Christian Scholars Conference a few weeks ago. So awesome. It's sort of out in the public sphere now, but it'll be in print next year.
Great.
but it's an article project on the disciples of Christ in Alabama in the 1920s, and they tried to start what would have essentially been a seminary that would have been officially connected with the University of Alabama in the 1920s. Would have been funded by the disciples, would have been taught by disciples, disciple-sponsored faculty members, but UA would have given credit and would have offered a Bachelor's of Divinity degree through this kind of hybrid arrangement. This was a time where the university was growing. This was sort of the early heydays of UA football and sort of the increased national stature of the university. Ultimately, it fell apart, didn't happen. The funding never materialized, as was the case for a lot of these kinds of lots of schools. But the Board of Trustees did actually approve the arrangement. UA signed off on it. But so when I first came across a reference to this, it was a book on disciples' colleges. There was just a reference to this School of Religion at Tuscaloosa. Well, I've lived in Tuscaloosa since 2008. I'd never heard of this. And so I started digging through, and where I went from there was I started looking through old newspapers. A lot of times these would be digitized, some were physical copies as well, just looking for any kind of reference to, School of Religion, University School of Religion, these kinds of things. Found a lot of material, and this kind of gets to your point about sifting. Sometimes newspapers, there might be 5 or 6 newspapers that would carry the same story or very similar, bit of detail, bit of information about the school. And so it was trying to figure out, which one of these seems the most credible, right? The Tuscaloosa News right here in town would tend to get higher preference from me than a paper from, halfway across the country that's getting second or third hand. There's a process of reading, trying to read critically, trying to make a best determination about which of these sources is most trustworthy. In cases where there were discrepancies coming up, try to figure out which had the most, which details were the most accurate, which ones were the closest to the source. And then, figuring out which things would help me tell the story, because there are all sorts of other, kind of rabbit holes we could sort of go down there, things to chase or leads to pursue. But ultimately, if I'm wanting to tell the story of this particular institution, I have to say, I'm going to start around this time, I'm going to end around this time, and I need to figure out what happened in between. And so when it comes to giving a conference presentation or writing an article, the goal is to tell a compelling story rooted in the historical evidence, a true story, not just sort of spinning yarns, much a little more rigorous than that. But to arrange the material in a way that informs the audience, that it is clear, it is understandable. Human experience is incredibly messy, and so at some level, at one level, our job as
understatement.
At one level, our job as historians is to sort of make things messy and to sort of convey the complexity of human experience. On the other hand, our finished products also need to actually leave the reader with something that they can take and understand. And so for me, really, that goal is always to tell the story of what happened in a way that is understandable and that hopefully communicates some kind of larger point.
Man, I love hearing you kind of work through that. That was one of the things that was a real treat for me when I was working on my dissertation, to be able to talk with you, especially at a couple of the different Stone Campbell Journal conferences we attended there in Knoxville, Tennessee. Man, it was so nice getting to talk with you, because my doctorate's in biblical studies, yours is in history proper. And it was just like, oh, I'm talking to a real historian, and I'm kind of doing some of this stuff too, but he knows what's up. So.
Well, it's funny now that I'm in a school of theology where I'm sort of the lone wolf who sort of didn't go that route through. And so I've kind of the imposter now. So
well,
shoes on the other foot.
So it seems like an MDiv is in your future, yeah.
I think I'm done with school at this point.
Okay, that's fair. One of the things that I have appreciated about my schooling, I was just joking about MDivs just a second ago, but one of the things I really appreciate about my schooling was that it did expose me to really, like you said, some of the messiness, some of the complexities of the history of our movement. And I'll say peculiar in the sense that it's atypical from a lot of church traditions that you can find here, say in the United States. Were relatively small compared to like anything that has the name Baptist on it. I mean, there's 1,000 of them, compared
Right.
to like every 10 of us. Yeah, okay, that's an exaggeration. Anyway, but one of the things I really enjoyed about my schooling was that I did get exposed to some of that stuff and got to really dig into see. It's like, oh yeah, there's some, and we had some guys that were just really awesome thinkers, and then we had some folks who sit back and think, what?
Yeah.
But for those who are kind of less familiar with some of the beginnings of the Stone Cannibal movement, and we've mentioned some names like Alexander Campbell. I think you mentioned T.B. Larimore, some other folks around that time. For those who are less familiar with some of the beginnings of this movement, can you kind of walk us through maybe a bird's eye view of like when did this movement that we are now a part of, when did that start? What was its major aims and goals? You mentioned restorationism. Help us kind of flesh that out a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure. This is going to be the very, very, very abbreviated version of, I'll go ahead and get on camera here, Visions of Restoration, the History of Churches of Christ.
Hey, there we go.
And put it in a book plug in for myself there.
Also by John Young.
Right. But so big picture, restorationism, the idea of going back to how things used to be, has been present within Christian theology, arguably since the 2nd century, right? Sort of, we need to go back how the apostles did it, or how that first generation did it. But in terms of our specific context, groups known as the Stone Campbell movement, the American Restoration movement, sometimes just referred to as the Restoration movement.
And that's insider language.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, the folks who use that terminology are generally insiders.
Right. The best answer I can give is sort of early 19th century, but that's with an asterisk next to it. That again, sure. There were a lot of different kind of very small movements, starting, really kind of in different places across the globe, but it kind of for our tradition specifically, looking back to a heritage in Britain, of people who were influenced again by these early ideas, or these ideas of going back to an apostolic order, going back to how things used to be, allowing the New Testament, or kind of a New Testament church, to be our model for faith and practice. A lot of those ideas get carried over, get brought over to North America, either kind of in the late colonial or early Republican period, and figures like Alexander Campbell, his father Thomas Campbell, Barton Stone, the men like these and women and others, all around the same time. There's just sort of these little pockets of Christians who, for one reason or the other, kind of start looking at what they're doing, and they find some what they see as omissions or flaws or unbiblical or unscriptural additions to what they need to be doing. Mm-hmm. And they start kind of breaking away gradually from more established churches. Some of these movements are coming out of Presbyterianism, some out of the Baptist Church, others from other circles. But there's all the one of the things that kind of holds this together, is this idea of restoration, of something is missing, right? Whether it's a practice, whether it's an idea, a belief, something that we're doing, we have had a hole, and we need to fill it. And what fills it comes from the 1st century. Again, and in a lot of cases, this is articulated as sort of the church hasn't existed, right? Like the actual church, hasn't existed in centuries, or a millennia plus. And so there's this idea of we're going to bring back something that was missing. At the same time, another important goal of many of these early restorers was also the unification of all Christians into one church. And that's something that at different times within our movement's history, those two, ideally, they're not mutually exclusive, but in practice, a lot of times they have pulled in different directions. But the desire to seek unity with Christians of all stripes at different times has pulled against the idea that we need to restore a particular understanding, or kind of a particular model of New Testament Christianity. And so throughout the 19th century, there was a lot of internal tension within the movement over issues such as the support of missionary societies that were congregations would kind of come together and work on particular efforts, the use or non-use of instruments in worship, other issues as well, which all sort of, I think you can make a case, sort of boil down to people reading scripture through different hermeneutics. Right? These are perhaps more symptoms than underlying causes. By the time we get into the 20th century, we see a recognition that basically the movement has grown in two different directions. What we now kind of see as churches of Christ, largely the a cappella, side of the movement. This is about a century ago, a little over a century ago. And then sort of the Christian church or disciples of Christ, which then later split. That's another story for another time. That is to say that kind of churches of Christ as being separate from the disciples, the Christian churches, often dated to 1906. This is when the U.S. Census Bureau sort of formally acknowledges that there are two groups there. But again, so I'm hesitant to put a date on this because you could say, well, Churches of Christ, 1906, but that misses the Restoration Movement before it. You say Restoration Movement, early 19th century, but it misses the much longer history of Restorationism within the Christian tradition. So it's a complicated story, but it is to say that these things have been percolating for a long time, but then kind of for our own specific movement. If I'm teaching a class on Restoration Movement history, I typically would start early 19th century with a sort of a quick gesture back towards the longer history of Restorationism or primitivism and bringing it up to the present day.
Yeah. Interesting too that you mentioned primitivism, because that was basically, if I'm remembering correctly, that was an attempt to cut away a lot of what would now be called high church elements from worship or from church polity or things along those lines. I'm thinking of groups kind of like who they're sort of colloquially referred to as pilgrims, but early Puritans or Anabaptists from parts of England. England had gone through, so you say early 19th century, but then before that, you've got kind of over 100 years or so of England, dealing with its church fractures, because 100 years before that. So we'll get into 1600s, 1500s. Okay, gosh, man, like we're back 500 years now. And, Henry VIII had political and personal reasons to kind of break away from Catholicism. That doesn't really get on very firm footing until really we get to Elizabeth I, right? And then Elizabeth I takes us all the way up to James I of England, James VI of Scotland, same guy, namesake of the King James Bible. And we're in Jamestown, the namesake of also Jamestown, the early colony. And it's wild how all that's kind of connected, but the fracturing of churches in England that eventually led to some kind of some degree of another persecution, leads to folks coming over here. Those European church struggles didn't stay in Europe. They took their toys and came over here and had the same fights.
Yeah, and not to play too much insider baseball here, but within the history, kind of historiography of the Restoration Movement, or which again, historiography is kind of the fancy word to say the study of how historical interpretations have changed over time. I can kind of feel listeners' eyes glazing over here, so I'll try to make this quick. But it's to say that interpretations change over time, right? We continue to study, we continue to understand things better. We go back to the archives, we try to read with fresh eyes. We try to come to more accurate and more faithful conclusions about the past than perhaps we have had before. But one of the things about the Restoration, or alternately the American Restoration Movement, that for many generations was kind of assumed this was sort of a uniquely American thing, even though many of the kind of the founding generation were people who were not born here in the U.S. Right? Sort of had been trained in universities and grown up in churches overseas. But we sort of assumed that it's kind of an American Restoration Movement, and even some of my writing uses that terminology, so I don't want to bash it too much. But there's been a lot of work in recent years. I think of a book by Jamie Gorman, Among the Early Evangelicals, which has done a lot to put a lot of Alexander Campbell's missionary work in this kind of broader Atlantic framework, and say that this is a story that's larger than just what was happening in the U.S. In the early 19th century. It's really connecting to these international kind of transnational threads as well.
Is that Jamie? Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, but it's Jamie Gorman or James Gorman, Among the Early Evangelicals. I believe that was his dissertation turned book.
Oh, awesome.
Definitely worth checking out. And it's a good overview of a lot of the origins of what would become the Campbell movement, as part of the Stone Campbell movement. Really focuses more on Campbell because of his connections, kind of missionary organizations, missionary societies, these kinds of things. But
Yeah.
definitely worth checking out. But it gets
So that was
kind of going back to.
Sorry, that was Among the Early Evangelicals.
Yes.
By James Gorman. Yeah. So for those who don't know, James Gorman is a professor at Johnson University in Knoxville, formerly Johnson Bible College. That Johnson is affiliated with the independent Christian churches, and that's something that we've mentioned earlier. Is sort of an offshoot of the Stone Campbell movement. That part of the world, especially where I was not that long ago, up in Central Kentucky, much more heavily prevalent. The presence of independent Christian churches is much more prevalent than, say, Church of Christ, which for those who grew up, say, in Nashville, Memphis, Dallas, Florida, places along those lines, places, in the heart of the Bible Belt, Church of Christ are everywhere. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thanks for the book recommendation by Jamie.
Yes.
Sorry to cut you off earlier. What were you going to say?
Oh, it was just circling back to that question of periodization and sort of where we start when we start talking about the Restoration movement. Periodization is another one of those kind of 50-cent historians terms. Basically, just means where we start and where we stop. But those questions can be surprisingly loaded because you're sort of saying, well, this counts as the movement, or this doesn't, based on where I start that story. So in practical terms, if I'm teaching a Restoration movement history class and I've got 13 weeks at church or 6 weeks at church, or I've got 14-week semester at Amridge, I tend to start the early 19th century because you could go back much further than that. From a practical standpoint, you sort of have to draw the line somewhere, but it's almost inconceivable to think about a Stone Campbell movement, a Restoration movement, without it standing on the shoulders of the Reformation movement, or a Luther, a Calvin, an Erasmus, even some of the, from those earlier generations. And so really to have that kind of that fuller picture of it, it requires us to go to dig a little bit deeper beyond our own immediate context.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Speaking of teaching classes like this at church, for the last few weeks, I've been teaching a class on Sunday evenings at church called Early Christians Speak. I've lifted the title of that class from a book by Everett Ferguson, who taught for years and years at Abilene Christian University here in Abilene, Texas. I say here, meaning I'm in Texas. I'm not in Abilene. Sorry, in Abilene, Texas. You could be in the same state and still be like 11 hours away.
Right. It's close enough. It's close enough.
Yeah. I'm literally closer to Louisiana than I think I am to like Abilene or anyway. Anyway, I've been teaching a class on Sunday evenings called Early Christians Speak, and basically what we've been doing is working through some of the 2nd century writings of early Christians, 2nd and 3rd century writings, this collection of folks known as the Apostolic Fathers. What I've wanted to show in that class is that when these folks are writing, they are working with Scripture. They're working with Old and New Testament. A lot of times the New Testament, but they're working with Old and New Testament. They are trying to figure out, how do we apply this? How in some ways do we adapt this to new or different situations that we find ourselves in? The thing that we started with first was this little work called the Didache. For folks who don't know, the word Didache, spelled Didache, Didache, it looks like did ache, is just a Greek word that means teaching or instruction, and it's the full title is the Didache of the 12 Apostles. It's a fascinating discussion and adaptation of things from, say, Sermon on the Mount. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, Didache adopts and adapts a lot from Matthew. There's also some things in there just about sort of like church practice at the time. It gives specific instructions on the way in which you baptize someone, which in the New Testament, it's just the assumption is there's enough water for you to fully, plunge the person under the surface of the water. In the Didache, they actually offer up some stipulations for what you do when you don't have enough water. And I always ask classes, well, what kind of climate can you envision having trouble finding water in? It's like, well, a desert climate. Okay, well, guess where a lot of early Christians lived. Okay, so anyway, That's been a fun class. It's been a Bible study because we've looked at, something that they'll say, and I'll show on the same screen something that Jesus says. Like, all right, look at what they're doing here. Do you think this is in line with Jesus's trajectory? What do you think? And it's fun to be able to ask those kinds of questions. It's even fun to be able to read something from the Didache or some other work in the Apostolic Fathers and say, do you agree with this? Because you can't really get a lot of good discussion with that kind of thing in a Bible class, because everybody knows at least, yes, we agree with it. Okay, but how many of you actually do it? That's a different story.
Right.
You've taught something kind of similar in some kind of way when we were talking about this the other day about sort of what we were wanting to do. I immediately thought of this class because of something that you had said. When you teach a class like this, either at church or someplace on this topic, what kind of stuff do you focus on? And is a class like that, is history like this even valuable for spiritual formation? Like how can you make something like this devotional and not just an intellectual exercise?
Sure. So I have not taught in a congregational setting anything related to patristics or sort of the Apostolic Fathers, kind of going that far back. I do teach an early church history graduate class at Amridge, and kind of your experience of sort of leading into those texts is very similar to mine. I usually assign students to read a Gospel and Acts over weeks 1 and 2, and then roll right into the Didache, some of the other Apostolic Fathers, and kind of begin asking those similar questions about trajectory and where we see continuity versus change, or continuity versus clarification, some might argue. And so kind of very similar approach, but thinking in a congregational setting, I've had the opportunity to teach a few classes on kind of Stone Campbell, Restoration Movement history. And in fact, my first book came out of a class series that I did at North Tuscaloosa. This would have been, probably 3 or 4 years ago now. And so when I was sitting down, kind of getting ready to start this series, I had initially 8 weeks that I was going to devote to. This was sort of a summer class. By the way, I worked in college and young professionals ministry the entire time I was in graduate school, first as an intern and then kind of leading the group. So he was responsible for picking out classes and, getting teachers lined up. So I had, an 8-week summer kind of summer block that I needed something to do. I was going to do a church history series. And at one level, there's sort of a lot of nuts and bolts kind of things. Sort of who were some of the important figures? Who was Alexander Campbell? Who was Martin W. Stone? Who was, David Lipscomb? Or even some of the other namesakes of the school, James Harding, some of these guys, right? That may or may not be quite as familiar. Our congregation, we have had several students who have, gone to Freed Hardman or to other, other colleges connected with the Churches of Christ. And, maybe they know those names, but they might not know much about the namesakes. And so kind of a little bit of those things. Some narrative history about talking about which issues were important at different times, and when divisions happened, but also when periods of unity and growth happened, successes and failures. Important to get both the good and the bad, but also using it as a way, and this kind of gets to your question about spiritual formation, and this circles also back around to something we talked about much earlier in this conversation, which is that sometimes the issues of the past, we're not even aware that those things are issues, but yet they have played incredibly important roles in kind of shaping the contours of where we are today. And the example here that comes to mind, and this was the class session where I had to do the most kind of groundwork laying back when I initially taught this, is on an early 20th century division within Churches of Christ over teachings about the millennium. And broadly speaking, today Churches of Christ are amillennial for the most part.
Can you unpack that term for sure. Our listeners for a second?
Yeah, so amillennial, kind of the position, looking at Revelation, kind of the reference to a millennium there, kind of a 1,000-year reign of Christ. And the amillennial position holds that is to be understood figuratively, not as a literal 1,000 years of Jesus reigning, as a more than a political figure, but sort of as a
Right.
political figure.
Yeah.
Contrasted with a couple of other schools of thought, premillennialism and postmillennialism. Postmillennialism is actually in a lot of the early members of the Stone Campbell Restoration movement were postmillennialists, including Campbell himself. And what this kind of the Cliff Notes version of this idea is that the work of the church would help perfect the earth, would perfect the world, would bring together Christians within the church, kind of unifying the church, restoring the church, would actually help perfect the world and bring the return of Jesus for this 1,000-year kind of perfect era. Again, this is the oversimplified version,
Mm-hmm.
whereas sort of the post-millennial view, because the millennium comes after this time of perfection. The premillennial view, on the other hand, again, the very simplified version is the idea that basically things will sort of continue as they are until the end of times. Jesus will return, will institute a 1,000-year time period of his rule, and then the judgment will take place after that. That things we are not going to perfect the world through our efforts. Somebody more pessimistic kind of worldview about the millennium. But again, both of those schools of thought hold to the existence of a literal millennium, kind of this 1,000-year period. Well, within the early 20th century, within Churches of Christ, a premillennial movement, kind of spearheaded in some ways by a guy named R.H. Bowl, kind of came up, most closely connected with churches in Louisville and New Orleans. But there was this massive division within the church, and sort of, people kind of like hounded this guy and his followers about their views on the millennium. And as a result, and again, kind of setting aside, personal views about which of these schools kind of best fits the biblical text, right? It created a situation where the amillennial position was so dominant that it's not even discussed, right? In a lot of circles, and even in my own experience in Churches of Christ, the amillennial perspective on the millennium was the only perspective put forward. Like this is the way that you understand this.
Right.
And so when I started sort of talking about, the premillennial controversy, I had to sort of go back and unpack what those were. And for some of the members in class, and these were people with college degrees, some of with advanced degrees, who had taken classes, had been in the members of the Churches of Christ their whole life. But had no vocabulary or no concept that you could sort of read that any differently. Well, of course it's figured. Of course it's not meant to be read. Well, actually, it's sort of a minority position in the larger Christian world to say that this is figurative. And so all that is to say, this is kind of getting to your original question here. As a historian, I tend to find myself talking in circles. I probably know what that's like.
You promised me we would chase a lot of rabbits when we were talking about this the other day, so I'm happy.
Oh, good. But getting back to that question is to say, well, where does this intersect with spiritual formation? It alerts us to new ways, or sometimes old ways, of reading passages, of ways of understanding, things about the gospel or things about the Bible, more broadly speaking. It also helps us think through what our views are, right? When we're sort of views that perhaps we have not ever had challenged before, or something that has been presented to us as this is how it is. But when we study history, when we study church history, we see people maybe believe something very different, and we might agree or we might disagree with that. We might come back to our original position and say, well, I think I had it right to begin with. I think this is a better reading. But we've still done the work. We've still thought through the issue. And hopefully, as a result, we have come to a better knowledge of the Bible, but also of God in that process. Secondarily, besides that, I think there's also some devotional applications of reading church history. I think there are things that are inspirational. I think reading stories of great thinkers, of great speakers, of humble servants from the past, at times can inspire us to redouble our efforts. I think we can also read cautionary tales from the past about times where the church maybe hasn't met the mark or sort of lived up to its calling. Can encourage us to hopefully do better in the present as well.
Yeah, I like all of that. And it really makes a lot of sense too, especially for someone who, like myself, was a history major and always appreciated kind of the lessons of history. Always just sort of inherently looked to see what had happened in the past and had tried to make sense of it in the present, because history was my best subject in high school. It was my favorite subject in high school. It made sense that I'd be a history major in undergrad. One thing that you mentioned also earlier, sort of value of church history for non-historians. The second thing you mentioned was the ability to empathize with different people's experiences. It's interesting. I can see a connection with that and kind of what you've just mentioned here, where it's tempting for us to, it's tempting for a lot of folks, I think, to experience some degree of what has been termed chronological snobbery. We can kind of look back at those quaint, simple fools in the past and realize that, well, maybe they were not so quaint and simple. Maybe there's a lot more complexity when we actually take the time to dig into what they're doing. One thing that actually got me into teaching from the Apostolic Fathers was a class that I started teaching and taught for, I think we did maybe like 5 or 6 weeks on it, just in the summer at one point when I was still preaching and working on my doctorate in Kentucky. It was on the heels of the Restoration Movement class that I mentioned earlier that my friend Garrett Best had done. And for those of you who are kind enough to watch or listen, you can check out from around the time of late June. That was when my episode with Garrett published on demystifying the book of Revelation. A great conversation, and got a little more in the works. I won't give away too much, but there's a little more in the works for Garrett and I talking about Revelation. But Garrett had finished up his tenure with us. He'd moved back to Memphis. And I was there to basically present the last week or two of his material on Restoration Movement history. I thought it would be interesting to go back even farther, right? Because the Restoration Movement, as you have said, and for those who are familiar, the Restoration Movement was intended to be a unity movement. Guys, surely we can all agree on the importance of Scripture. If we can just read Scripture in this simple way, we should be able to figure out what's going on. And on paper, that sounds really great. The problem, like you've said, and others have noted too, is, well, we have interpretive lenses, right, for how we understand. Is this practice or example binding versus this practice or example, etc. Another conversation for another time. But the Restoration Movement was intended to be a unity movement. So I thought, okay, well, what if we go back to earliest attempts of unity? Some of those earliest attempts are the different creeds that came up. And one interesting thing that the Restoration Movement tried to do was to try to cut through all these creedal additions and kind of caps that we would put on Scripture, where people would say, I accept this version of this creed, well, you accept this version of this other creed, and well, anyway, we can't even agree on what creeds, neglecting the entire Bible. I went back and said, all right, well, let's look at, here's something that's going on in church history. This was a real threat. This guy named Marcion, this was a real threat to church unity. And that's spelled Marcion for those who are listening and watching. For those who are watching, I have some of these names and stuff that John and I have mentioned kind of show up on the bottom of the screen here. But this guy Marcion presented a real threat because he was kind of questioning some things about God and the Bible. And there are other folks too who had some very peculiar views about the nature of Jesus, his divinity versus humanity and stuff like that. Attempts to maintain unity led to the development of these kinds of statements that we now know as creeds. And I walked this class through this church of about 90 or so folks. On a good Wednesday night, we'd have 20 or 25 there in the auditorium. And I walked us through some of these early versions of things like the the Apostles' Creed, and other ones like that. It's like kind of went by line. Some of these is like, okay, we would all affirm all of this, right? Yeah, there's nothing in here that we would not affirm. The reason why this kind of thing developed is because they were being threatened, like church unity, church doctrine and practice was being threatened. And so they, in an effort to maintain unity, said, all right, this is the lens, right? This is the lens that we're going to read scripture. And everyone in here in this auditorium tonight would affirm, yeah, absolutely. I'm down with that. 100%. I can roll with that. That led to not a huge degree of empathy for some of this kind of stuff. But I think some folks began to say, oh, okay, maybe there was some honorable things that we end up looking at later and think, I wouldn't go that route. But maybe some of this stuff did start out honorably. And some of these early Christians, second, third century Christians, things that they did, I now can understand that in that moment of desperation to maintain unity or protect historic orthodoxy, yeah, I can see why they did that kind of thing. That is a case in point of being able to empathize, like you mentioned earlier. I think also too, it kind of, I can be a little bit more gracious to them because I understand sort of some of the threats that they were going. Hopefully, God will be gracious to me as well when he sees my attempts. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and this would be, maybe perhaps another discussion for another day, but one of the difficulties of kind of the common sense school of philosophy, or the common sense hermeneutic, which has really been so prevalent, right, in the history of the Restoration movement. And this is sort of the very simplest version of this is this idea that, as applied to Scripture, that if we all approach reading the Bible in good faith, we're all reading the same things, we should come to the same conclusions. That is an incredibly laudable idea, right? We would want to think that we would be able to find agreement in what Scripture says. But the flip side of that coin, or at least as it has played out in our history at times, is the underlying twin assumption that if we don't come to the same conclusion, well, I know I'm reading it accurately. Kevin must not be reading it in good faith, or he must be trying to insert his own opinions into this. If he was really committed to understanding, he would see things how I do. And again, that gets into a whole other conversation about how we read Scripture and the best ways to do that, and some of the pitfalls of various ways. But it is just to say that the idea of returning to roots, restorationism, of seeking that goal of being like the early church, at times was tempered with that unity, that goal of finding unity. But in other times, the unity kind of got thrown out, and it can lead, sort of can still lead to a pretty graceless perspective, where it's sort of I'm right, and by virtue of disagreeing with me, you are wrong, and you're not reading Scripture in good faith.
When that common sense approach, like you said, the positive side of that is you extend to the other person the dignity of their rationality, right?
And the ability for they have the ability just as much as I do to read and to come to conclusions. But the problem was when I bind my common sense interpretation as the only common sense interpretation of something, and substitute my wisdom for the common sense wisdom of humanity, that becomes an issue.
Yeah, that's at best it's noble. At worst, it's sort of self-aggrandizing in a very ugly way. John, is there anything that you would want to leave us with as we begin to wrap up today?
I think I've probably chased enough rabbits today. So for the three people that are still listening, we'll go ahead and let them break for lunch early.
There is an extra star in y'all's crown. We appreciate it.
Yes.
Well, John, this has been a lot of fun for me. You and I, it was a dinner at like a THEI Fridays or something there in Knoxville, where you and I sat next to each other and we geeked out about history and stuff like that. It has been a lot of fun being able to dig into some of these things with you. And for those who are kind enough to stick with us, I appreciate this. I hope that y'all have been encouraged to maybe learn a little bit more about not just the 2,000 years of specifically Christian history, but particularly history of churches of Christ. And maybe even one interesting place to start might be the history of your own congregation. I mean, Some churches that have been around in places that are sort of pockets of the Bible Belt, like Florence or Nashville or other places like that. Some of those congregations have been around for quite a while and have a rich history that you might not even know about. Let me encourage y'all to dig into that kind of stuff as well. John?
Or perhaps if you're feeling adventurous, consider writing one.
Hey!
We need more congregational histories for historians of future generations to know what we were up to in 2021.
Yeah. No, like that is actually an admirable task. I mean, if anything, it would definitely help those who are interested in being elders or deacons or working at those kinds of congregations to know the spiritual history of your church, or even your family too. That's another way you kind of maybe engage in this fun exercise that we've been talking about. John, I really appreciate it, sir, and I'm honored to be able to share this conversation time with you. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure to join in for the conversation today. Appreciate your friendship.
Likewise. Take care, sir.
As well. Bye-bye.